The autumn wind carried the scent of rain as Abigail Porter stumbled up the church steps, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a worn leather satchel containing everything she owned in the world. The year was 1878, and the small town of St. Elmo, Colorado, was her last hope after a journey that had nearly broken her spirit. "Please," she whispered, her knuckles white as she rapped on the heavy wooden door. The sound echoed in the gathering dusk, competing with the distant rumble of thunder. Behind her, the main street of St. Elmo was already emptying as shopkeepers closed up for the evening, casting curious glances at the unfamiliar woman in the tattered blue dress. The door creaked open, revealing Reverend Thaddeus Miller, his thin face pinched with disapproval as his gaze traveled from Abigail's face to her pronounced belly and back again. No wedding ring adorned her finger, a fact that didn't escape his notice. "I've traveled so far," Abigail said, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "I need shelter just for tonight. The baby, we don't provide comfort for women of your situation," the Reverend interrupted, his voice cold as the approaching storm. "This is a house of God, not a refuge for sinners who refuse to repent. But I have nowhere else to go," Abigail pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "The stagecoach left me here, and the hotel won't take me without proper payment." "Then perhaps you should have considered the consequences before your indiscretions," he replied, already closing the door. "We maintain certain standards in St. Elmo." The heavy door slammed shut with finality, leaving Abigail alone on the steps as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of desperation, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought back sobs. The baby kicked vigorously, as if protesting their rejection. With nowhere else to turn, she slowly descended the steps, each movement careful as the cobblestones grew slick with rain. The dirt street was quickly turning to mud, clinging to the hem of her dress as she made her way toward the edge of town, hoping to find a barn or stable where she might shelter for the night. The rain fell harder now, plastering her dark hair to her face and neck. Night was falling quickly, and with it came a bone-deep chill that made her shiver uncontrollably. The lights of St. Elmo's main street grew distant behind her as she followed a smaller trail that led toward what appeared to be scattered homesteads outside the town proper. Miss, hold up there," the voice came from behind her, deep and urgent. Abigail turned, blinking against the rain, to see a tall figure approaching on horseback. For a moment, fear gripped her. A woman alone had much to fear from strangers, especially in her vulnerable state. But the alternative was a night in the storm, which might well kill both her and her unborn child. The rider drew closer, and she could make out a broad-shouldered man astride a chestnut mare. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the weather and a long, oilskin duster that gleamed in the fading light. "Miss, you shouldn't be out in this," he called, reining his horse to a stop beside her. "Not in your condition." Abigail took an instinctive step back, one arm protectively curved around her belly. "I'll be fine, sir," she replied, though they both knew it for the lie it was. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, keeping a respectful distance between them. Now that he was closer, she could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a weathered face and eyes the color of summer sky. A day's worth of stubble darkened his jaw, and when he pushed his hat back, she caught sight of sun-bleached brown hair. "Lucas Everett," he offered, touching the brim of his hat. "I have a place about a mile from here, nothing fancy, but it's dry and warm." He glanced toward town, then back at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Church turned you away." Abigail nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Reverend Miller's got strong opinions about certain things," Lucas said, his tone making it clear he didn't share them. "Look, I'm not in the habit of leaving women and children out in storms. My sister lives with me, so you'd be proper chaperoned if that's your concern." The baby gave another strong kick, and Abigail winced, placing a hand against her side. The decision wasn't really a decision at all, it was survival. "Thank you," she managed. "I'm Abigail Porter." Lucas nodded, then gently took her satchel and secured it to his saddle. "Can you ride?" he asked, eyeing her condition. "I can manage," she assured him, though in truth she wasn't certain. With surprising gentleness for a man of his size, Lucas helped her onto the mare, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with his other hand. "Hold tight," he instructed, and urged the horse forward through the downpour. They rode in silence, the storm intensifying around them. Abigail tried to maintain her composure, but exhaustion and the day's rejections had worn her down. When a particularly strong contraction seized her, she couldn't contain a small gasp. "Almost there," Lucas assured her, his voice close to her ear. "Just hold on a bit longer." Through the curtain of rain, a small homestead materialized, a sturdy cabin with light glowing from its windows, a barn set off to one side and what appeared to be corrals beyond. As they approached, the cabin door swung open, spilling golden lamplight onto the porch. "Lucas, that you?" called a female voice. "It's me, Rebecca," he called back, "and we've got company." The woman in the doorway hurried down the steps as Lucas helped Abigail dismount, keeping a steadying hand at her elbow when her knees threatened to buckle. "Good heavens," Rebecca exclaimed, taking in Abigail's bedraggled state and advanced pregnancy. Without hesitation, she slipped an arm around the stranger's waist. "Come inside, quickly, you're soaked through." Between the two of them, they guided Abigail into the cabin's warmth. The interior was simple but clean: a main room with a stone fireplace where flames crackled merrily, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a small kitchen area, and doors leading to what she presumed were bedrooms. "Lucas, fetch clean towels and stoke that fire up," Rebecca ordered, helping Abigail to a chair close to the hearth. "And put some water on to boil." As Lucas moved to obey, Abigail got her first clear look at Rebecca Everett. She was perhaps a few years older than Abigail's 22 years, with the same striking blue eyes as her brother, though her hair was a shade darker. Her practical calico dress and apron suggested she'd been in the midst of cooking when they arrived. "You poor thing," Rebecca said, helping Abigail remove her sodden shawl. "You're chilled to the bone." "I'm sorry to impose," Abigail began, but Rebecca waved away her apology. "Nonsense. No one should be out in weather like this, especially not." She glanced meaningfully at Abigail's belly. Lucas returned with towels and a blanket, which Rebecca took from him. "I'll help her get dried off and into something warm," she told her brother. "Perhaps you could check on that stew." With a nod, Lucas retreated to the kitchen area, giving the women space. Rebecca helped Abigail dry her hair and face, then draped the blanket around her shoulders. "How far along are you?" she asked quietly. "Nearly 8 months, I think," Abigail replied, grateful for the other woman's matter-of-fact approach. Rebecca nodded. "Have you been having pains?" "Just the usual discomforts and some tightening now and then," Abigail admitted. "The journey has been difficult." "I imagine so. Where have you come from?" "Missouri originally, then Kansas. I've been traveling for almost 2 months." Rebecca's eyes widened. "All that way in your condition." "Alone?" Abigail nodded, her throat tightening. The kindness of these strangers after so much rejection threatened to unravel what little composure she had left. "Well, you're not alone anymore," Rebecca declared, patting her hand. "Let's get you into some dry clothes. I think some of mine might fit, with a few adjustments." As Rebecca helped her toward one of the bedrooms, Abigail caught Lucas watching them, concern evident in his expression. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "You have a home here," he said simply. "For as long as you need it." The simple declaration, spoken without hesitation, broke something inside Abigail. After weeks of doors closing in her face, of sidelong glances and whispered judgments, the straightforward offer of sanctuary was overwhelming. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she allowed Rebecca to lead her away. In the small bedroom, Rebecca helped her out of her wet clothes and into a clean nightgown that had been let out at the seams. "It was mine when I was carrying my daughter," Rebecca explained, seeing Abigail's questioning look. "She's 5 now, staying with my husband's parents in Denver for a few weeks. My Henry passed 2 years ago. Pneumonia took him in the winter." "I'm so sorry," Abigail said, recognizing the shadow of grief that crossed the other woman's face. "Thank you," Rebecca replied softly. "It gets easier with time, though never easy." She helped Abigail into the bed, tucking blankets around her. "Rest now, I'll bring you some stew and tea shortly." Left alone, Abigail sank into the first real bed she'd occupied in weeks. The pillow was soft beneath her head, the blankets warm and smelling faintly of lavender. Outside, the storm raged, but here she was safe. Her hands cradled her belly as she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. When Rebecca returned with a tray, Abigail managed to sit up, realizing just how hungry she was as the aroma of beef stew reached her. "It's nothing fancy," Rebecca apologized, setting the tray across Abigail's lap. "It smells wonderful," Abigail assured her, accepting the spoon. The first bite confirmed it rich broth, tender beef, and vegetables that spoke of careful tending in a kitchen garden. "Lucas said the church turned you away," Rebecca said, settling in a chair beside the bed. There was no judgment in her voice, only a sad understanding. Abigail nodded, focusing on her stew. "The Reverend didn't approve of my situation." "Reverend Miller wouldn't recognize true Christian charity if it sat in his pew on Sunday," Rebecca remarked with unexpected tartness. "Not the first time he's turned someone in need away, and likely not the last." Abigail managed a small smile at that, warmed by the other woman's indignation on her behalf. "May I ask?" Rebecca began, then hesitated. "Is there someone we should send word to? The baby's father, perhaps?" Abigail set down her spoon, her appetite suddenly diminished. "No," she said quietly, "there's no one." Rebecca nodded, accepting this without pressing further. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until after the baby comes," she said decisively. "It wouldn't be safe for you to travel now anyway." "Your brother might have something to say about that," Abigail pointed out. A smile touched Rebecca's lips. "It was his idea, actually. Lucas has always had a soft spot for strays, be they four-legged or two." She stood, taking the empty bowl. "Finish your tea and get some sleep. Things will look brighter in the morning." After Rebecca left, Abigail sipped the sweet tea, listening to the murmur of voices from the main room. The siblings were discussing her, no doubt, but there was no tension in their tones, just the practical considerations of accommodating an unexpected guest. For the first time in months, Abigail allowed herself to relax fully. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she and her child were safe. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Abigail woke to birdsong and the smell of coffee and bacon, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous evening came rushing back, and she placed a protective hand over her rounded belly. "Good morning in there," she whispered to the baby, who responded with a series of energetic movements that made her smile despite her uncertainty about what the day would bring. A soft knock at the door preceded Rebecca's entrance, already dressed for the day in a practical blue dress, her hair neatly braided and coiled at the nape of her neck. "I thought I heard you stirring," she said cheerfully. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Much better, thank you," Abigail replied, and it was true. A night's rest in a real bed had done wonders for her physical state, even if her broader circumstances remained precarious. "Wonderful. I've brought you some of my older dresses that might accommodate your condition," Rebecca said, laying several garments across the foot of the bed. "They're not fancy, but they're clean and serviceable." "You're very kind," Abigail said, genuinely moved by the woman's generosity. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you and your brother." Rebecca waved away her thanks. "Neighborliness isn't about repayment. Besides, it will be nice to have another woman around. Lucas is a good brother, but his conversation tends toward cattle prices and weather predictions." This drew a small laugh from Abigail, perhaps her first in weeks. "Still, I don't want to be a burden. I can work cooking, cleaning, mending. I'm quite skilled with a needle." "We'll discuss all that after you've had breakfast," Rebecca replied. "Lucas is already out seeing to the stock, but he'll be in shortly. Take your time getting dressed and join us when you're ready." Left alone, Abigail selected the largest of the dresses, a faded green calico with enough room to accommodate her belly if she didn't pull the laces too tight. She washed her face in the basin of clean water Rebecca had provided, then did her best to tame her thick, dark hair into a simple braid. The mirror above the washstand reflected a woman she barely recognized, too thin in the face despite her rounded middle, with shadows beneath her hazel eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. But there was color in her cheeks this morning, and perhaps a glimmer of hope had returned to her gaze. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Rebecca at the stove, turning bacon in a cast iron skillet. The cabin looked even more welcoming in the daylight, simple but well-made furniture, colorful rag rugs on the plank floors, curtains at the windows, and shelves holding books and small mementos that spoke of a life well lived. "Something smells amazing," Abigail said by way of greeting. Rebecca turned with a smile. "Just in time. Have a seat at the table, the coffee's fresh if you take it." "Not since I learned I was expecting," Abigail replied, settling awkwardly into a chair, "but I wouldn't say no to tea if it's not too much trouble." "No trouble at all," Rebecca assured her, placing a steaming mug before her. "Lucas keeps bees, so we're well supplied with honey." As if summoned by his name, the cabin door opened, and Lucas Everett stepped inside, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. In the clear light of day, Abigail could see him properly for the first time. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his skin tanned from outdoor work, with laugh lines at the corners of his eyes despite the seriousness of his expression. His clothes were plain but well kept, a simple cotton shirt, denims, and worn boots that spoke of daily labor. "Morning," he greeted, his eyes finding Abigail with an assessing look that seemed to be checking her welfare rather than passing judgment. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Everett." "Lucas," he corrected, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Mr. Everett was my father, and a more contrary man never drew breath." Rebecca laughed as she set plates of eggs, bacon, and biscuits on the table. "Lucas flatters him. Pa was ornery as a mule with a toothache." The siblings' easy banter created an atmosphere that invited Abigail to relax, to momentarily set aside her troubles. As they ate, the conversation turned to the day's work: fences that needed mending, a mare about to foal, vegetables ready for harvesting in the kitchen garden. "I'd like to help," Abigail offered when there was a pause. "I'm stronger than I look, and I've done farm work before." Lucas and Rebecca exchanged a glance that she couldn't quite interpret. "That's kind of you," Lucas said carefully, "but in your condition, I'm with child not made of china," Abigail interrupted, a flash of her natural spirit asserting itself. "I've been traveling alone for weeks. I think I can manage to pick beans or gather eggs without shattering." A slow smile spread across Lucas's face, warming his blue eyes. "Fair enough," he conceded, "but nothing too strenuous, and you'll rest when you need to." Deal," she agreed, relieved to have a purpose, however small. After breakfast, Rebecca showed Abigail around the homestead while Lucas returned to his work. The Everett place was modest, but well-maintained: 20 acres of land with the cabin and barn at its heart, a vegetable garden, a chicken coop, a small orchard, and pastures for the horses and small herd of cattle that provided their livelihood. "Lucas runs cattle on larger grazing land to the west," Rebecca explained as they collected eggs from the henhouse. "Not a big operation compared to some, but enough to keep us comfortable, and I sell preserves and honey in town for extra." "It's a lovely place," Abigail said sincerely, carefully placing eggs in the basket Rebecca had given her. "You've made a real home here." "Our parents left it to us when they passed 5 years ago," Rebecca replied. "Lucas could have sold out and moved on, plenty of younger men do, but he's rooted to this land like one of those old oaks by the creek." Abigail nodded, understanding. "Some people need a place to belong. And others?" Rebecca asked gently. "Others learn that belonging isn't always about place," Abigail answered after a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. "Sometimes it's about who you're with." Rebecca's expression softened with understanding. "The baby's father, was he someone you loved?" The question was asked without judgment, but Abigail still felt the familiar sting of shame and anger that accompanied thoughts of Thomas. "I believed so at the time," she admitted. "He was passing through our town, handsome, charming, full of stories about places I'd only read about. He promised to send for me once he was settled in California. But he never did," Rebecca guessed. Abigail shook her head. "When I wrote to tell him about the baby, the letter came back marked no such person at this address. That's when I realized the name he'd given me was probably as false as his promises. "I'm sorry," Rebecca said simply, but with genuine compassion. "My parents gave me a choice: give up the baby when it came, or leave their house and never return," Abigail continued, the words spilling out now that she'd started. "They were respected in the community, active in the church. My indiscretion was an embarrassment they couldn't tolerate." Rebecca's expression darkened with indignation. "Some Christian charity," she muttered, "so I left," Abigail concluded. "I had a little money saved, and I thought I could make it to Denver, where I have a cousin. But the money ran out faster than I expected, and the further along I got, the harder it was to find work or lodging." "Well, your travels are over for now," Rebecca declared firmly, "at least until that little one arrives safely." The days that followed fell into a peaceful rhythm. True to her word, Abigail helped with the lighter household chores, shelling peas on the porch, mixing dough for bread, mending clothes in the evenings by lamplight. Rebecca proved to be not just a generous hostess, but a friend, sharing stories and skills, never pressing for more of Abigail's history than she volunteered. Lucas was often busy with the ranch work, but he joined them for meals and occasionally in the evenings. At first, he was reserved around Abigail, careful to maintain a respectful distance. But gradually, as she became a fixture in their household, his natural warmth emerged. He had a quiet sense of humor, a thoughtful nature, and a patience that manifested in everything from breaking horses to teaching Rebecca's daughter to read during her visits. One evening, about a week after Abigail's arrival, she sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. The air was cooling, but not unpleasantly so, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention, and she looked up to see Lucas returning from checking the far pastures. He dismounted with easy grace, removed his saddle and bridle, and turned his horse into the corral before approaching the porch. "Quite a view," he remarked, gesturing toward the sunset as he settled on the step below her chair. "It's beautiful," Abigail agreed. "I never tire of it." Lucas studied her face for a moment, then asked, "How are you settling in?" Truly, the question caught her off guard with its directness. "Better than I had any right to expect," she answered honestly. "You and Rebecca have been so kind." She broke off, emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "You've had precious little kindness lately," Lucas observed, his voice gentle. "That's a failing of people, not a reflection on you." Abigail blinked back tears, touched by his understanding. "Still, not many would open their home to a stranger in my situation." "Maybe more should," he replied simply. After a brief silence, he added, "Rebecca told me a bit about your circumstances." "Not details," he hastened to add, "just enough to understand." "And do you?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. "Understand," Lucas considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I understand that life rarely follows the paths we expect," he said finally. "And that people who claim to know God's judgment often forget his mercy." His words eased something tight in Abigail's chest. "The reverend in town wouldn't share your view." A wry smile crossed Lucas's face. "Reverend Miller and I have had our disagreements on various matters of faith and practice. He finds me disappointingly liberal in my interpretations of Scripture." "Is that why you weren't in church last Sunday?" Abigail asked. Rebecca had gone alone, returning with reports of pointed sermons about moral failings that had clearly been directed at their household's new arrangement. "Partly," Lucas admitted. "Also, someone needed to stay with you just in case." The simple consideration touched her deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not just for that, but for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me that night." Lucas's expression grew serious. "I'm glad I did," he said, his voice low and sincere. Their eyes held for a long moment before he cleared his throat and rose. "I should wash up before supper. Rebecca gets particular about trail dust at her table." As he disappeared into the cabin, Abigail remained on the porch, watching the last of the daylight fade. Something had shifted between them in that quiet exchange, a recognition, perhaps, that their connection was growing beyond mere charity on his part or gratitude on hers. The thought was both comforting and unsettling. She had trusted a man's words once before, with disastrous consequences. And yet, Lucas Everett was nothing like the smooth-talking Thomas who had abandoned her. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet integrity that showed in everything from how he treated his livestock to the respect with which he addressed every person, regardless of station. Inside, she heard Rebecca's voice calling her to supper, and with a small sigh, she heaved herself from the chair, one hand supporting her ever-expanding middle. Whatever was developing between her and Lucas would have to wait. First, there was a child to bring safely into the world and a future to secure for them both. The days grew shorter as September gave way to October, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned golden against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. Abigail's time grew nearer, her movements more cumbersome as the baby settled low in her womb. Rebecca had sent for the midwife, a sturdy woman named Martha Jenkins who lived on the outskirts of St. Elmo. She visited once to examine Abigail, declaring both mother and baby to be in good health despite the hardships of recent months. "The babe is positioned well," Mrs. Jenkins assured them. "First babies often take their time, but when yours decides to make an appearance, send for me straight away." Lucas had been notably absent during the examination, making himself scarce with ranch chores that suddenly couldn't wait. His shyness about such matters endeared him further to Abigail, who found his combination of strength and gentle consideration increasingly compelling. One crisp afternoon, Abigail was hanging laundry on the line while Rebecca worked in the garden, when the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention. A wagon was coming down the lane to the cabin, driven by a man Abigail didn't recognize, with Reverend Miller seated beside him. "Well, this is unexpected," Rebecca murmured, removing her gardening gloves. "The Reverend rarely graces us with his presence." Abigail felt a flutter of anxiety. "Should I go inside?" Rebecca's jaw set in a determined line. "Absolutely not. You're a guest in our home, and you have nothing to be ashamed of." The wagon pulled to a stop in the yard, and Reverend Miller descended, followed by the other man, who Abigail now recognized as one of the church elders she had glimpsed in town. The Reverend's gaze lingered disapprovingly on Abigail's prominent belly before he addressed Rebecca. "Mrs. Hayes, good afternoon. We've come on a matter of community concern," he announced, his tone suggesting he was delivering an official pronouncement. "Reverend Miller," Rebecca acknowledged coolly. "Mr. Patterson, what brings you all the way out here?" The Reverend straightened, clasping his hands behind his back. "It has come to the attention of the church council that you and your brother are harboring a woman of questionable character." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Abigail. "Such arrangements reflect poorly on the moral standing of our community." Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Rebecca stepped slightly in front of her, a protective gesture that spoke volumes. "Mrs. Porter is our guest," Rebecca stated firmly. "And I fail to see how offering shelter to a woman in need reflects anything but Christian charity, something you might recall from your Sunday sermons, Reverend." The Reverend's thin lips pressed into an even thinner line. "There are proper channels for such charity, Mrs. Hayes. The Fallen Women's Home in Denver, for instance." "I'm not fallen," Abigail interrupted, finding her voice despite her pounding heart. "I made a mistake in trusting the wrong person, but that doesn't make me any less deserving of basic human kindness." "Young woman," the Reverend began, his tone sharp with reproof, but he was interrupted by the sound of the barn door opening. Lucas emerged, clearly alerted to the visitors by their voices. He approached with measured steps, his expression carefully neutral, though Abigail could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Reverend, Mr. Patterson," he greeted, coming to stand beside his sister and Abigail. "What brings you to our place?" The Reverend repeated his concerns, couched in terms of community standards and moral influence, while Lucas listened without interruption. When the man finally ran out of steam, Lucas remained silent for a long moment, his gaze steady. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. The Reverend blinked, clearly unused to such direct address. "Mr. Everett, I understand you may have acted from misguided compassion, but there was nothing misguided about it," Lucas cut in, his voice level but with an undercurrent of steel. "Mrs. Porter needed help and we provided it. That's the beginning and end of the matter as far as I'm concerned." But the example it sets is exactly the example I aim to set, Lucas finished for him. Helping those in need without judgment. Isn't that what your sermons advocate, Reverend? Or does that principle only apply when it's convenient and doesn't challenge your personal sensibilities? The Reverend's face flushed with anger. This is not merely a matter of personal opinion, Mr. Everett. The church council has no authority over who I welcome into my home, Lucas stated firmly. Now, if you've said your piece, I'll thank you to leave my property. Mrs. Porter doesn't need the upset in her condition. For a tense moment, it seemed the Reverend might continue to argue. But something in Lucas's steady gaze must have conveyed his immovability on the subject, because the older man finally inclined his head stiffly. Very well. But consider carefully the company you keep, Mr. Everett. Reputations, once tarnished, are not easily restored. With that parting shot, he turned and climbed back into the wagon, followed by the elder who had remained silent throughout the exchange. As they drove away, Rebecca released a breath Abigail hadn't realized she was holding. Well, that was bracing, she remarked, trying for lightness despite the tension still evident in her posture. I'm so sorry, Abigail said, distress evident in her voice. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. Lucas turned to her, his expression softening. You haven't, he assured her. The Reverend's notions of propriety are his own concern, not ours. But what he said about your reputation is of no consequence, Lucas interrupted gently. What matters is doing what's right, not what's deemed acceptable by men like Reverend Miller. The simplicity and certainty of his statement silenced any further protest Abigail might have made. Instead, she found herself blinking back tears, moved by his unwavering support. Thank you, she whispered. Lucas's gaze held hers, something unspoken passing between them that caused her heart to quicken. Then Rebecca cleared her throat, breaking the moment. I think this calls for some of that apple pie I baked yesterday, she declared. Come inside, both of you, the laundry can wait. As they followed Rebecca into the cabin, Lucas's hand brushed lightly against Abigail's, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. Either way, it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the autumn sunshine. That evening, after Rebecca had retired to her room, Abigail found herself alone with Lucas by the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending occasional drafts down the chimney that made the flames dance. Do you think they'll cause more trouble? Abigail asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Lucas looked up from the bridle he was repairing. The Reverend, he might try, but there's not much he can actually do. We're well respected in these parts despite his opinions. Because of your parents. Partly, Lucas acknowledged. My father was one of the first settlers in this valley, but mostly because people here value hard work and honesty over gossip and judgment, at least, most of them do. Abigail nodded, her hands continuing their work on a small gown she was sewing for the baby. Rebecca had provided fabric from her own supplies, insisting that every child deserved to enter the world with at least a few new things made especially for them. Still, she said after a moment, I hate to think I've positioned you and Rebecca against your neighbors. Lucas set aside his work, giving her his full attention. Abigail, he said, the rare use of her name causing her to look up. You haven't positioned us anywhere we haven't chosen to be, and frankly, any neighbor who'd condemn you without knowing your story isn't much of a neighbor to begin with. The conviction in his voice warmed her as much as the fire. You've been kinder than I had any right to expect, she said softly. It's not kindness, he replied, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. It's seeing someone worth standing beside. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning beyond the words themselves. Abigail's hands stilled on her sewing as she absorbed what he was telling her and what he wasn't saying outright. Lucas, she began, but was interrupted by a sharp pain that caused her to gasp and press a hand against her side. Lucas was on his feet immediately, concern replacing the tender expression of moments before. What is it? Should I wake Rebecca? Abigail took a deep breath as the pain subsided. No, it's nothing. The baby is just very active tonight. Lucas didn't look convinced. Are you sure? Mrs. Jenkins said it wasn't that kind of pain, Abigail assured him, though in truth she wasn't entirely certain. The discomfort had been stronger than the practice contractions she'd been experiencing over the past few weeks. "I promise I'll say something if it becomes regular." Reluctantly, Lucas returned to his seat, though his eyes remained watchful. The intimate moment had passed, but something had shifted between them nonetheless, an acknowledgement of feelings that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. As Abigail resumed her sewing, she was acutely aware of his presence across from her, of the way the firelight caught in his hair and illuminated the strong lines of his profile. Despite all the uncertainties in her life, one thing was becoming undeniably clear. She was falling in love with Lucas Everett, a complication she had neither expected nor prepared for. The question that remained was whether such feelings could ever lead anywhere, given her circumstances and the child that would soon arrive, a living reminder of her past mistakes. The answer came sooner than she anticipated, and in a manner she could never have predicted. 3 nights later, Abigail woke shortly after midnight to a persistent ache in her lower back and a tightening sensation across her abdomen that was stronger than anything she'd felt before. She lay still, waiting to see if it would pass, but after several minutes, another wave came, more intense than the first. "Oh," she whispered into the darkness, a mixture of anticipation and fear washing over her. After weeks of waiting, wondering, preparing, it seemed her child was finally ready to make an appearance in the world. With careful movements, she lit the small lamp beside her bed and eased herself up. The floor was cool beneath her feet as she made her way to Rebecca's room, hesitating before knocking softly. "Rebecca," she called, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. Within moments, the door opened to reveal Rebecca, her hair in a loose braid over her shoulder, blinking sleepily. "Abigail, what is it?" I think it's starting," Abigail replied, one hand pressed to her belly as another contraction began to build. Rebecca was instantly alert, taking Abigail's arm to steady her. "How far apart are the pains?" "I'm not sure yet. 10 minutes, perhaps, but they're getting stronger." Rebecca nodded, her expression calm but purposeful. "Let's get you back to bed. I'll fetch some water and towels, then wake Lucas to ride for Mrs. Jenkins." She helped Abigail back to her room, settling her comfortably before hurrying to prepare. Abigail heard her speaking quietly to Lucas, then the sound of him moving quickly through the house and out the door. Minutes later, hoofbeats receded into the distance as he rode toward town. Rebecca returned with a basin of water, clean towels, and a determined expression that did much to settle Abigail's nerves. "First babies usually take their time," she assured her, arranging supplies neatly on the bedside table. "Mrs. Jenkins will be here well before things get serious." But the baby, it seemed, had other ideas. The contractions intensified rapidly, coming closer together with each passing hour. By the time the first gray light of dawn appeared at the windows, Abigail was gripping the bedsheets, breathing heavily through waves of pain that left her gasping. "Where are they?" she panted as Rebecca bathed her forehead with a cool cloth. "They'll be here," Rebecca soothed, though Abigail could see concern in her eyes. "Lucas is a fast rider and Mrs. Jenkins doesn't waste time." Another contraction seized her, stronger than any before. When it finally released its grip, Abigail sagged against the pillows, exhausted but determined. "The baby isn't waiting," she said, meeting Rebecca's gaze. "I can feel it." Rebecca checked her progress, then nodded, her expression resolute. "You're right. We're going to have to do this ourselves, at least until help arrives." Despite her fear, Abigail felt a surge of gratitude for this woman who had become more than a hostess, a friend, a sister in all but blood. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. Rebecca squeezed her hand. "So am I. Now, when the next pain comes, I want you to bear down with it. Your body knows what to do, Abigail. Trust it." What followed was a blur of pain, effort, and determination unlike anything Abigail had ever experienced. Time lost all meaning as she focused entirely on the monumental task of bringing her child into the world. Rebecca was a steady presence throughout, offering encouragement, wiping her brow, guiding her with a calm confidence that belied any anxiety she might have felt about managing the birth alone. Just as Abigail felt she could endure no more, the door burst open, admitting Mrs. Jenkins with her medical bag, followed by a pale-faced Lucas who took one look at the scene before hastily retreating to the main room. "Well now," Mrs. Jenkins declared, rolling up her sleeves as she approached the bed, "it seems this little one is eager to meet the world." "You're doing splendidly, Mrs. Porter." With the midwife's experienced guidance, Abigail found new reserves of strength for the final push. And then, miraculously, amidst the pain and exhaustion, came the indescribable moment when her child slipped into the world with a lusty cry that filled the room. "A boy," Mrs. Jenkins announced, efficiently clearing his airways before placing the tiny, squirming infant on Abigail's chest. "And a fine one at that." Abigail gazed down at her son through tears of joy and relief. He was perfect 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair plastered to his head, and a healthy pair of lungs that he was using to full effect. As she touched his tiny cheek with a trembling finger, he quieted, his unfocused eyes seeming to search for her face. "Hello, little one," she whispered, love unlike anything she had ever known washing over her in an overwhelming wave. "I've been waiting for you." Rebecca, wiping tears from her own eyes, leaned in to get a better look at the baby. "He's beautiful, Abigail. Absolutely perfect." Mrs. Jenkins efficiently delivered the afterbirth and tended to Abigail's needs while Rebecca cleaned and swaddled the newborn. When all was settled, the midwife pronounced both mother and child to be doing well, promising to return the next day to check on them. "Shall I send your brother in?" she asked Rebecca as she prepared to leave. "He's been pacing the floorboards out there like a nervous father." Rebecca glanced at Abigail, who nodded her agreement. "Yes, please," she replied. "I think he's earned the right to meet our newest resident." After Mrs. Jenkins departed, Lucas appeared cautiously in the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and wonder. "May I?" he asked, hesitating at the threshold. "Of course," Abigail replied softly, adjusting the blanket around her son's tiny form. Lucas approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the small bundle in Abigail's arms. When he reached her side, he knelt to bring himself level with them, his gaze moving from the baby's face to Abigail's with unmistakable tenderness. "He's something, isn't he?" he said, his voice hushed with awe. "Would you like to hold him?" Abigail offered, surprising herself with the suggestion. But it felt right, somehow, to share this moment with the man who had offered her shelter when she needed it most. Lucas looked startled, then honored. "Are you sure?" At her nod, he carefully washed his hands in the basin Rebecca provided, then accepted the swaddled infant with gentle hands that seemed too large for such a delicate burden. The baby stirred briefly, then settled against his broad chest, apparently content in the warmth of his hold. "He trusts you," Abigail observed, touched by the picture they made this strong man cradling her newborn son with such care. "Smart boy," Lucas replied with a small smile, his finger lightly tracing the curve of the baby's cheek. "He's got a good judge of character like his mother." The simple compliment warmed her heart. "I haven't always made the wisest choices," she admitted, thinking of Thomas and all that had led her to this moment. "Perhaps," Lucas acknowledged, his eyes meeting hers over the baby's head. "But you've shown incredible courage in facing the consequences of those choices. That counts for more in my estimation." Before Abigail could respond, Rebecca cleared her throat from where she stood arranging fresh linens. "I'll leave you two for a moment," she said, a knowing smile playing at her lips as she slipped from the room. Alone with Lucas and her son, Abigail felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and elation, vulnerability and strength. "I haven't decided on a name yet," she said, watching as her baby's tiny fingers curled reflexively around Lucas's much larger one. "No rush," Lucas replied, carefully returning the infant to her waiting arms. "You'll find the right one when you're ready." As he settled the baby against her, his hand brushed hers, lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Their eyes met, and in his, Abigail saw something that made her heart skip a beat, a depth of feeling that went far beyond neighborly kindness or even friendship. "Abigail," he began, his voice low and serious. "I know this might not be the right time with everything you've just been through, but I want you to know that you and your son have a place here for as long as you want it. Not out of charity or obligation, but because," he paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Because having you here these past weeks has made this house feel more like a home than it has in years." The sincerity in his voice brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes. "Lucas, you don't need to say anything now," he assured her quickly. "Rest, recover. We can talk more when you're stronger." With that, he rose, gently squeezing her hand before leaving her alone with her newborn son. As the door closed behind him, Abigail looked down at the tiny life cradled in her arms, this miracle who had brought her to St. Elmo through hardship and rejection, only to find unexpected acceptance and perhaps, just perhaps, the beginnings of love. "What do you think, little one?" she whispered to the sleeping infant. "Shall we stay a while longer?" The baby sighed in his sleep, his perfect mouth forming a tiny O that Abigail chose to interpret as agreement. Smiling, she leaned back against the pillows, allowing exhaustion to claim her at last, safe in the knowledge that for now, at least, she and her son were exactly where they belonged. The days following the birth passed in a haze of newfound motherhood for Abigail. She named her son Samuel, after her maternal grandfather, a kind man who had always treated her with gentle affection and who had passed away before he could see how her life had unfolded. "Samuel," Lucas repeated when she told him, testing the name on his tongue. "It suits him." Strong name for a strong boy. The pride in his voice when he spoke of her son warmed Abigail's heart. Though Samuel was not his blood, Lucas had taken to the child with an immediate and genuine affection that spoke volumes about his character. He would often hold the baby in the evenings, his large hands cradling the tiny form with surprising gentleness, while Abigail rested or helped Rebecca with supper. For her part, Rebecca proved invaluable in those early days, offering guidance and support as Abigail navigated the challenges of nursing and caring for a newborn. Her own experience as a mother made her a patient teacher, never judging when Abigail struggled or grew frustrated with her own inexperience. "Every mother feels overwhelmed at first," she assured Abigail one evening as they sat before the fire, Samuel asleep in his makeshift cradle nearby. "It gets easier, I promise." October gave way to November, bringing shorter days and a sharp chill to the mountain air. The first snow dusted the peaks visible from the cabin's windows, a reminder that winter was approaching. With it came the unspoken question of what would happen next for Abigail and her son. She had recovered well from the birth, regaining her strength more quickly than even Mrs. Jenkins had predicted. Soon, she was able to resume helping with household chores, adapting to working with Samuel either sleeping nearby or secured against her chest in a sling Rebecca had fashioned. The conversation Lucas had started on the day of Samuel's birth remained unfinished, though Abigail often caught him watching her with an expression that suggested he had not forgotten his words. For her part, she found her feelings for him growing deeper with each passing day, yet hesitated to acknowledge them openly. Her son had to be her priority now, and despite Lucas's kindness, she was wary of presuming too much or misreading his intentions. The matter came to a head one afternoon in late November. Samuel, now nearly 2 months old, was napping in his cradle, and Rebecca had gone into town to sell preserves and purchase supplies. Abigail was kneading bread dough at the kitchen table when Lucas came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots at the door. "Storm's building," he remarked, hanging his coat on the peg. "Good thing Rebecca planned to stay in town tonight with her friend Martha." Abigail nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach at the realization that they would be alone in the cabin, save for Samuel. "Will the livestock be all right?" she asked, focusing on punching down the dough. "They're all secure in the barn," Lucas assured her, moving to wash his hands at the sink. "Plenty of feed and fresh water. They'll weather it fine." He dried his hands on a towel, then came to stand beside her at the table, watching her work the dough with practiced movements. "You've become quite the baker," he observed. "Rebecca says your bread is even better than hers, though she'd never admit it to your face." Abigail smiled, pleased by the compliment. "My mother taught me. It was one of the few things we truly enjoyed doing together." The memory brought a pang of homesickness, not for the place she had left behind, but for the relationship with her parents that had been fractured beyond repair by her pregnancy. Lucas seemed to sense her shift in mood. You miss them, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. I miss who they were before, Abigail clarified, shaping the dough into a neat loaf. The parents who taught me to read, who sang hymns with me on Sunday mornings, who told me I could be anything I set my mind to. She sighed. Not the people who turned their backs when I needed them most. Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his presence beside her solid and reassuring. Have you written to them since Samuel was born? He finally asked. Abigail shook her head. What would be the point? They made their position quite clear. People can change their minds, Lucas suggested gently. Especially when a grandchild is involved. Perhaps, Abigail conceded, though she wasn't convinced. But even if they did, I'm not sure I could forgive so easily. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Lucas said, his voice thoughtful. It's about not letting the hurt control your future. The wisdom in his words struck her, and she paused in her work, looking up at him with new appreciation. When did you become so philosophical, Lucas Everett? A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. Spend enough time alone with your thoughts out on the range, and you either go mad or start figuring things out. Their eyes held, and Abigail became acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his body in the cool kitchen. Without conscious thought, she found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something deeper than physical attraction, a recognition of kindred spirits, perhaps, or the comfort of being truly seen and accepted. Lucas's gaze dropped to her lips, his expression softening with unmistakable longing. For a breathless moment, it seemed he might close the distance between them. Then Samuel's cry rang out from the bedroom, breaking the spell. Abigail stepped back, her cheeks flushing. I should, of course, Lucas said quickly, moving aside to let her pass. I'll see to the fire. As she tended to her son, changing and feeding him before bringing him out to the main room, Abigail's mind was in turmoil. The almost moment in the kitchen had confirmed what she had suspected for weeks. Lucas's feelings for her extended beyond simple kindness or charity. And her own response had made it impossible to deny that she returned those feelings in full measure. But what did that mean for her future? For Samuel's, she had come to St. Elmo with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child in her womb, dependent on the generosity of strangers. Could she now allow herself to hope for something more, a family, a home, a love she had once thought forever beyond her reach? The storm arrived in full force as evening fell, wind howling around the eaves of the cabin and snow piling against the windows. Inside, however, was warmth and light, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, lamps glowing on the table where they ate a simple supper of stew and fresh bread. Samuel, fed and content, lay in his cradle nearby, occasionally making the small, snuffling sounds that Abigail had come to know meant he was dreaming. Lucas had been quieter than usual throughout the meal, and Abigail wondered if he was regretting their near kiss or perhaps contemplating how to let her down gently. As she rose to clear the dishes, Lucas reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Leave them, he said softly. Sit with me by the fire for a while. The request was casual, but something in his tone made her heart quicken. With a nod, she abandoned the dishes and followed him to the hearth, settling into one of the two comfortable chairs that flanked the fireplace. Outside, the wind moaned, punctuated by the occasional crack of a snow-laden branch, but inside the cabin was a cocoon of warmth and stillness. For several minutes, they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance. Then Lucas cleared his throat, his expression serious in the flickering light. I've been thinking, he began, about what happens when winter passes. Abigail's stomach tightened with apprehension. Was this his way of telling her it would soon be time for her to move on? Oh. She managed, trying to keep her voice neutral. Yes, he continued, his gaze fixed on the fire. About you and Samuel and what you might want for your future. She waited, heart pounding, for him to continue. When I found you that night in the rain, Lucas said, his voice low and thoughtful, I acted on instinct. Someone needed help and I could provide it. Simple as that. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. But what started as a simple act of charity has become something else entirely, at least for me. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? Lucas leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. I mean that having you and Samuel here these past months has made me realize how empty this place was before, how empty my life was." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I know your circumstances are complicated. I know you came here carrying someone else's child and someone else's broken promises, but I also know that I've come to care for you, Abigail, for both of you in a way I never expected." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to Abigail's eyes. "Lucas, let me finish," he requested gently. "Please," she nodded, blinking back her tears. "I'm not asking for any promises right now," he continued. "I know you've had enough of those to last a lifetime. But I want you to know that if you choose to stay in St. Elmo to make your home here permanently, there would always be a place for you and Samuel with me, not as guests or charity cases, but as—" he hesitated, searching for the right words, "as family if you were willing." The offer hung in the air between them, breathtaking in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Abigail sat very still, absorbing the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "You hardly know me," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas smiled, a gentle curve of his lips that reached his eyes. "I know enough," he replied. "I know you're brave and resilient. I know you love your son fiercely. I know you can bake bread that makes a man forget his troubles and that you sing to Samuel when you think no one is listening." His expression grew more serious. "And I know that, when I look at you, I see the woman I want to share my life with if she'll have me." Abigail's heart felt too large for her chest, expanding with emotions she had thought herself incapable of feeling again after Thomas's betrayal. "And Samuel?" she asked, needing to be certain. "Samuel is part of you," Lucas said without hesitation. "I already care for him as if he were my own. In time, I would hope to be a father to him in every way that matters." A tear slipped down Abigail's cheek, followed by another. "I never thought," she began, her voice catching, "never imagined I could find this after everything that happened." Lucas rose from his chair and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Is that a yes?" he asked, hope evident in his face. Instead of answering with words, Abigail leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle, tentative kiss that quickly deepened as Lucas responded with restrained passion. His hands moved to cradle her face, thumbs brushing away her tears as he kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the kind of man he was. When they finally parted, both breathless, Abigail rested her forehead against his. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to staying. Yes to building a life here. Yes to us." Lucas's smile was radiant in the firelight. He leaned in to kiss her again, but was interrupted by a small, indignant cry from the cradle. They both laughed, the joyous sound mingling with Samuel's demands for attention. "Seems he has an opinion on the matter," Lucas remarked, rising to his feet. "He approves," Abigail assured him, moving to lift her son from his cradle. "He's just reminding us that it's a package deal." Lucas wrapped an arm around her shoulders as she cradled Samuel against her chest, the three of them forming a perfect tableau before the fire. "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said softly, his free hand gently stroking the baby's dark hair. As the storm raged outside, inside the cabin, a new family was taking shape, forged not from blood or obligation, but from choice and love and the courage to begin again. The winter of 1878-79 was one of the harshest in Colorado's memory, with storms that buried St. Elmo under feet of snow and temperatures that froze the creek solid. But inside the Everett cabin, warmth prevailed not just from the constantly burning fire in the hearth, but from the growing bonds of the makeshift family that sheltered there. Lucas and Abigail were married by a justice of the peace in early December, a small ceremony attended only by Rebecca and her daughter, Mrs. Jenkins, and a few of Lucas's most trusted ranch hands. Reverend Miller had refused to perform the service, citing concerns about the hasty nature of the union and Abigail's questionable past, but neither bride nor groom was particularly bothered by his absence. "Some blessings were better off without," Rebecca had remarked dryly after delivering the Reverend's refusal. The wedding itself was simple but joyful, with Abigail wearing a blue dress that Rebecca had helped her make and Samuel, dressed in his finest gown, sleeping peacefully in his aunt's arms throughout the proceedings. When Lucas kissed his bride at the conclusion of their vows, the small gathering erupted in cheers that woke the baby, who added his own squalling voice to the celebration. Their life together fell into a comfortable rhythm as winter tightened its grip on the mountains. Days were filled with the work of maintaining the ranch through the harsh weather-breaking ice on water troughs, ensuring livestock had adequate feed and shelter, keeping paths clear between the cabin, barn, and outbuildings. Evenings were spent in domestic tranquility sharing meals, reading aloud by lamplight, planning for spring planting, and watching in wonder as Samuel grew and changed with each passing day. For Abigail, who had spent so many months in uncertainty and fear, the security of her new life was sometimes overwhelming. There were nights when Lucas would find her standing by Samuel's cradle, tears streaming silently down her face. "What is it?" he would ask, his arms encircling her from behind, his chin resting gently on her shoulder. "I'm just so grateful," she would invariably reply. "For him, for you, for all of this." And Lucas would hold her closer, understanding without words the depth of what she had survived and the courage it had taken to trust again. Not all moments were so tender, of course. They argued, as all couples do about household matters, about whether Samuel was old enough for this or that, about Lucas's occasional tendency to track mud across freshly swept floors. But even in disagreement, there was respect and the unshakable foundation of love that grew stronger with each passing day. Their physical relationship, too, developed with a sweetness that healed old wounds. Lucas was patient and gentle, understanding that Abigail carried scars from her experience with Thomas that went beyond the visible. He never pressed or demanded, allowing her to set the pace of their intimacy, responding with such tenderness to her hesitant advances that she gradually shed the shame and fear that had colored her view of such matters. In his arms, she discovered that physical love could be a joyful communion rather than a transaction or a manipulation. And in her response to him, Lucas found a passion and depth of feeling that exceeded anything he had imagined during his years of solitude. By the time winter began to loosen its grip on the mountains, with snowmelt swelling the creek and the first green shoots appearing in the sheltered spots around the cabin, Abigail knew she was carrying Lucas's child. The knowledge filled her with a mixture of joy and trepidation, joy at the new life created from their love, and fear that complications might arise. "Are you certain?" Lucas asked when she told him, his expression a complex mixture of surprise and elation. "As certain as I can be without Mrs. Jenkins confirming it," Abigail replied, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "I recognized the signs from before." Lucas's face broke into a broad smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. "Samuel is going to be a big brother," he marveled, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "Are you happy about it?" "Very," she assured him, resting her head against his chest, though a bit nervous as well. "That's natural," he murmured into her hair. "But you won't be alone this time." Not for a single moment. The promise warmed her heart, as did his immediate and practical response to the news insisting that she rest more, taking on additional chores without being asked, and enlisting Rebecca's help in ensuring Abigail ate properly and avoided overly strenuous work. Samuel, now 6 months old, and showing a distinct personality that combined Abigail's thoughtful nature with an adventurous streak all his own, was blissfully unaware of the changes to come. He had begun to sit up independently, and was showing a keen interest in solid foods, much to Lucas's delight. The bond between man and child was beautiful to witness Lucas teaching Samuel simple games, carrying him about the property to inspect the ranch operations, reading to him from the same books his own father had once read to him. "He may not have my blood," Lucas often remarked, "but he has my heart, complete and entire." Spring brought new life to the ranch in more ways than one. Calves and foals were born, the garden was planted, and Samuel achieved milestone after milestone: his first tooth, his first attempts at crawling, his first clearly articulated mama. Each small triumph was celebrated as if it were a major achievement, with Lucas as enthusiastic as any blood father could be. In May, Abigail finally found the courage to write to her parents in Missouri. The letter was neither accusatory nor pleading, simply a factual account of her life since leaving their home, her journey west, the hardships she had endured, Samuel's birth, her marriage to Lucas, and their expectations of a second child in the autumn. She included no request for forgiveness or reconciliation, merely an open door should they wish to know their grandchildren. "Whether they respond or not," she told Lucas as he rode into town to mail the letter, "I needed to write it, for my own peace if nothing else." Lucas nodded, understanding as always. Sometimes the healing is in the reaching out, regardless of what comes back. Summer brought the busiest season on the ranch, with cattle drives to manage, hay to harvest, and garden produce to preserve for the coming winter. Abigail's pregnancy progressed well, her body seeming stronger and more resilient this time around. Samuel thrived in the warm weather, crawling everywhere with remarkable speed and pulling himself up on furniture in preparation for his first steps. In July, to Abigail's astonishment, a letter arrived from Missouri. It was from her mother, the handwriting so familiar it brought tears to her eyes before she even broke the seal. The contents were cautious but not unkind expressions of relief that Abigail was safe and well, questions about Samuel, congratulations on her marriage and the coming child. There were no apologies for their treatment of her, but neither was there any condemnation of her current life. "It's a beginning," Lucas observed when she shared the letter with him. "More than you had yesterday," Abigail nodded, dabbing at her eyes. "I never thought I'd hear from them again. I'm not sure how to feel about it." "You don't have to decide right away," he assured her, his hand warm on her shoulder. "Take time to sit with it." She did, ultimately responding with a letter of her own that included a small pencil sketch Rebecca had made of Samuel. The correspondence continued, gradually warming in tone as the months passed, building a fragile bridge across the chasm that had seemed unbridgeable a year before. Autumn painted the mountains in gold and crimson, and with it came the harvest, the first frost, and the quickening of Abigail's time. Unlike Samuel's sudden and precipitous arrival, this baby gave fair warning, a gradual onset of labor that allowed for proper preparations. Mrs. Jenkins was summoned well in advance. Rebecca ensured everything was in readiness, and Lucas, though banished from the birthing room, remained just outside the door throughout the process, his pacing audible to all within. After 6 hours of labor, considerably shorter than her first experience, Abigail gave birth to a daughter with a crown of reddish gold hair and her father's striking blue eyes. "She's perfect," Lucas breathed when he was finally allowed to enter, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed at the tiny bundle in Abigail's arms, just like her mother. They named her Grace Elizabeth Everett, Grace for the blessing she represented in their lives, and Elizabeth for Lucas's mother. Samuel, not quite a year old and uncertain what to make of this new addition to the family, was gently introduced to his sister, his small face solemn as he patted her head with careful hands under his parents' watchful eyes. "Family," Lucas said simply, his arm around Abigail's shoulders as they watched their children together for the first time. "Our family." The word held a world of meaning: security, belonging, love unconditional and enduring. For Abigail, who had once been turned away from the very doors that should have offered sanctuary, it represented everything she had thought lost to her forever. As winter once again settled over St. Elmo, bringing with it the quiet season of reflection and rest, the Everett cabin stood warm and bright against the gathering darkness. Inside, a family created not by convention or circumstance, but by choice and love faced the future together: a cowboy who had opened his home and heart, a woman who had found the courage to trust again, and the children who gave purpose and joy to their shared journey. And if, occasionally, when a winter storm howled around the eaves, Abigail found herself remembering that desperate night when she had stood alone and forsaken on the church steps, it was only to marvel at how far she had come from desolation to belonging, from rejection to acceptance, from solitude to the embrace of true and lasting love. For in the end, It was not the church or society's approval that had saved her, but the simple human kindness of a man who saw beyond her circumstances to her worth as a person. "You have a home," he had told her on that rain-swept night. And in making good on that promise, Lucas Everett had given Abigail Porter not just shelter, but the greatest gift of all, a place to belong completely and without condition for all the days of her life.